With Hamnet releasing on digital, a day before it landed online, I took myself down to the local cinema and wanted to witness what was being described as an immersive, heartbreaking tale on the big screen, and I'm definitely glad that I did. This movie was 2 hours and 15 minutes of pure immersion, and it captivated me from the moment that it began. I watched two strangers become lovers. The lovers then drift apart whilst holding on to different priorities, and I also saw how a tragedy can end up birthing something that goes on to span a period of time far longer than any mortal being could ever. Within this video, I wanted to wander through the woods of Hamnet, discuss the deeper themes that I took away from it, analyse the true purpose of the film, the differences in both Hamnet and Agnes, the way they grieved, and the importance of that dark pit that lay within the forest. Here is a deep dive into the movie Hamnet. This video will contain spoilers on the movie, so you've been warned. The focus on the different ways we grieve. One major theme that was explored in this movie was the theme of death and how both the mother and father can grieve the loss of a child completely differently to the other. Agnes was the person that pretty much raised her and Will's children on her own with the help of Will's mother, as Will had a desire to make something of himself in London as a playwright, so he was putting the company that he was working for above time spent with his own family. This led him to be away from the family for extended periods of time, and in the eyes of Agnes, when Hamnet was lying on the floor, screaming in agony as death was wisping him away during the night because Will had told his son to look after the girls and to be strong, so he burdened that responsibility. She ultimately didn't think that Will could understand any of the suffering that she'd gone through in losing a child that way. This wasn't only because he didn't witness their son expiring, but it was also because for the longest of times he'd been away from home and she felt as though he cared more about the company than he did his own family. However, that wasn't the case as we saw towards the end of the movie. Agnes losing Hamlet rendered her to the point of being paralysed, and it altered her persona completely. There was a part of her that almost felt like the time with her children was on borrowed time because of what happened when Judith was born. When she was born, she wasn't breathing, and the idea of what was given could be taken away at any moment was something that was within her mind. All Agnes needed during that time was support from Will, because in losing her only son, she was broken, but Will was nowhere to be seen. She continued to mourn her son long after he'd passed away, and she was connected to all of the things that reminded her of him. For example, she didn't want to move to Stratford-upon-Avon because Hamnet was born in the very house that they lived in. She stayed in his bed, and the idea of life going back to normal was something that she just simply couldn't fathom. The world had completely collapsed around her, but for everybody else, life was just going on, and it was something that she just couldn't get her head around. She wasn't ready to return to a world without Hamnet. She was prepared to stay in that pit of darkness for the rest of her life if it meant that she could hold on to the memory of Hamnet and feel close to him. When it came to Will and him losing his son, we didn't see him grieving outwardly like his wife was. We saw the complete opposite in the sense that he was grieving internally, and even though he was away from his family, it showed that he was still feeling the weight of the loss. I thought it was interesting that Agnes simply viewed Will being away from his family as something that wasn't weighing on his mind, when in reality, I feel like it was the complete opposite to that. At around the 1 hour mark in the movie, there was a scene of Will walking around London, a place that looked like the slums and was also riddled with disease at that time, and as the scene was unfolding, I felt a sense of loneliness within him. It was almost like within his mind, he was questioning if being without his family was worth the lonely life that he was living with the hopes of becoming the playwright that he wanted to become. That's where I feel the guilt that he felt about not being with Hamnet, his son, somebody who idolized him and missed him when he would leave for London, came to the forefront towards the end. Will had essentially left his family to pursue art, and we saw that in the end, the art was the very thing that was the highest tribute he could give to his son, and it ultimately allowed his son's name to live on for a period of time that he never would have reached if he'd have walked the earth for longer. Will channeled his grief and turned it into art, and I'll get onto that in the next section of the video, but with Will grieving inwards and Agnes grieving outwardly, it showed the sheer difference that can be present when grief takes a hold and the paralytic state that it can put on some, and how grieving internally can also be perceived as not caring. Something that I also thought stood out with Will was that he didn't tell his wife that he'd written a play about their son, that he'd named it after him, nor did he tell them that he was living in a tiny box room in the attic whilst they lived in the largest house in the entirety of Stratford. It showed that he almost didn't care for the riches that this life brought him, and that the success that he had cost him more than anything he could ever be rewarded with for his art. The power of art. The climax of the movie came in the final 25 minutes of it when we saw Will's play Hamlet being depicted on screen. This was all about highlighting how art can be used as a passageway in grief. It can be used as a tribute to those that are gone, and it can outlive the lifespan of the person that it's in tribute to or the people that walk the earth. The sheer difference in emotions and attitude that Agnes had when she first entered the Globe Theatre to when the play concluded was drastically different. And in her instance, it showed the journey through grief that the play took her through, and that it was through that medium where she was finally able to be healed and she was able to close off the grief that had paralysed her. Yeah, she'd continue to mourn her son, but it wasn't going to be all-consuming like it once was. When Hamnet was alive, he spoke of a goal in life to his mother for when he was older to be up on stage, performing one of his father's plays, participating in a sword fight, and ultimately being declared as victorious, and that's exactly what we saw unfolding for the character of Hamlet when he was on stage. So with Agnes looking on, holding out her hand, witnessing the power of the words that had been written by Will, and seeing the resemblance to her son, with the entire Globe Theatre captivated by what had just unfolded, when the character died, she then saw her son on that very stage entering the centre of the forest. The place which in my mind represented entering the afterlife and her painful grieving process coming to a close. Through the tragedy that they suffered, Will put pen to paper and utilised this medium as a way of preserving the memory of their son in a way that nobody else would truly know about other than himself and his wife. What was a very private loss turned into a public piece of entertainment with a very personal, private meaning. I think it's arguably one of the most beautiful things ever, because Hamlet is a play that was written between 1599 and 1601, and here we are now in 2026 still talking about the play over 400 years later that was written in honour of a father mourning his son. If that's not a way of immortalising somebody that one cares for that has passed away, I don't really know what is. It's a legacy that Agnes would most likely never have even dreamed of or imagined. I thought it was quite moving when we saw Agnes look at Will right at the end of the play, and as she'd begun to let go of her pain that she was feeling, she looked at Will, and for the first time, she understood the pain that he'd been going through in private, and that this was his own personal way of dealing with the loss of his son. It had impacted him, but just not in the same way. The horrific and sudden death of his son brought about the birth of something so meaningful. What we also saw was how a very private experience is something that many people were able to relate to. The entirety of the Globe Theatre fell silent during the play, and the way that a large portion of the audience was reduced to tears as it concluded, with their arms reaching out to comfort Hamlet's transition into the afterlife, showed how art is ultimately what connects us all and can bring those of different backgrounds and classes together. The theme of love, what is given can be taken. A major theme that was also explored within the movie was the love that both Will and Agnes had for each other, and also the love that a mother has for her children. We quite literally saw the story of them being strangers, Agnes being this fiercely independent woman that didn't want to be with Will, to them falling in love, having their children, being fiercely independent again, Will leaving, Agnes raising the children, sitting with Hamnet as he passed away, Will returning, and then Will leaving to go back to the company. Even after all of that, we saw that the love between two people who originally started this whole journey together, even though it was on the cusp of wavering at one point due to the loss that they were suffering and the different ways that they were coping, the true, strong, all-encapsulating love was still there at the end, and that was the very thing that contributed to them getting through it. There was one piece of dialogue that really stood out to me in the movie, and it was, "What is given can be taken away at any moment." This was spoken by Will's mother when Judith had the plague, and it was connected to the fact that when she was born, she wasn't breathing, and that how when she was the one that was on the cusp of dying, it was almost like death itself coming to claim the debts that were owed. Agnes as a mother was fighting for her children in ways that couldn't be comprehended. The plague coming to England and claiming the life of Hamnet was something that brought to light the fragility of life and how everything can change in the blink of an eye. As that's exactly what we saw with Agnes's life. For example, she thought everything was fine, then Judith was unexpectedly unwell, then Hamnet was unexpectedly unwell, and he was the one that ended up dying. Life is fragile and it has to be appreciated because you never know when you're going to draw your last breath. The symbolism of the forest. The hole in the heart of the forest was something that I just couldn't help but think about throughout the entirety of this movie, and also long after it had concluded too. There was a moment around halfway through the movie where Will was looking directly into it, Agnes was deeply connected to it, and as we saw, she gave birth inside of it. Plus, it was even painted onto the set of Hamlet. There would also be this ominous music that would often play whenever it would cut to it, so it made me think of darkness and dread whenever we'd see it. To me, the hole in the heart of the forest symbolized a journey into the unknown and the afterlife. We first saw it being treated that way with the hawk that Agnes had cared for, as when it died, it was laid to rest there, and then during the ending we saw that once the play had concluded, after laying eyes on his mother and father, Hamnet walked into the darkness that was in the middle of the woods. With it being the very thing that Agnes was seeing with her eyes, it was also focused around the fact that she'd come to the conclusion that she was willing to step out of mourning and was ready to begin healing after her son's death. There was a line of dialogue in this movie that mentioned a greater purpose beyond this life and not truly knowing what lied beyond, hence why it was dark. And one could almost say that when Hamnet was in the courtyard, it was almost like this type of purgatory, a place where he almost couldn't transition until he knew that his mother was okay. He was told by his father in the early part of the movie to be strong for them when he left for London and that he wanted him to protect them, and with him doing that for his sister when she was sick and taking her place, he was now doing it for his mother in not leaving her until she was ready and okay to move on herself. My review of the movie. Hamnet is one of the best movies that I've watched this year, so far. It moved me in ways that I didn't expect to be moved, and there were several occasions where I was welling up in the cinema because of the powerful nature of what was happening. I remember one moment was when Hamnet died, another was when Agnes was breaking down in front of Will and saying that he didn't know how she was feeling because he wasn't there. Another was when Agnes believed that Will was writing a comedy, but when she looked down, the play was called Hamlet. I don't know why, but there was something about seeing his name written down on the program that just really hit me. And finally, the ending. There were so many emotional moments during that climax. I'm a huge fan of movies that are a bit of a slow burn, and this one is exactly that, but amplified even more. It was only 2 hours and 15 minutes, but I'd say it felt longer than that for certain. I'm not saying that in a way that's painting it out to be negative, but I just think because it was so slow and we saw the characters from the moment that they met up until Agnes had gotten over some of her grief, it really did feel like a full journey. I loved it, so I don't have any issues, but I'm just letting you know so you get a gist of the pacing. Another thing that I'll say about the way that this film moved was that the climax genuinely was the ending. The rhythm of the way that the story was told did gradually allow it to increase more and more, but it was steady, so it felt like an enjoyable ride with the crescendo really landing at the end. I was just sinking into the seat because it was just a seamless experience. Whilst Paul Mescal did a phenomenal job in this movie, there are two performances that I think deserve praise above that one. The first is Jacoby Jupe as Hamnet. The convincing nature of the character and the different emotions that he had were just oozing through the screen. I felt like I saw the boy that cared for his sisters but was mourning his father because he was just never around. He was his best friend and all he wanted was to be near him and to be like him. That ending scene as well, where not a single word was spoken when he was on stage, but he was looking at his mother before he left with that singular tear in his eye. It was emotionally shattering. Then, I also want to praise Jesse Buckley. She's nailed on for an Oscar for this performance, right? This was her movie. Most of the story was from her perspective and the pain that I felt from her, whether it be the loudest of screams when she was giving birth, or even when she lost Hamnet, to the most silent of moments where the silence just consumed me. I mourned Hamnet because I felt so connected to Agnes, and that was entirely down to the performance by Jesse Buckley. The moment that will live in my head rent-free whenever I think of this movie is that 60-second close-up shot of her face where we see her going through a world of emotions as she watches her son walk away into the afterlife. For me, that scene alone bagged her the Oscar. It was the perfect way for the movie to finish. In terms of the way that this film looked, it was gorgeous on the eye. It had a real muted colour palette which focused on earthy tones and it suited the time period and environment perfectly. You don't often see a movie that's set in the 1500s or around that time period, so it made for a refreshing change. I know I've spoken about the scene around the globe a lot, but I thought it was arguably the most immersive scene in the entirety of the movie. I loved how we were watching the play as if we were an audience member there. It allowed the weight of Hamlet to be felt and for us to experience the same emotions as to what the actual audience members were feeling. Hamnet is a movie that I wasn't surprised by because I didn't think it'd be good, but it was one that I was surprised by because I didn't expect it to move me as much as it did. I love a movie where you just catch a glimpse of life, and this was exactly that. But as well as that, I loved that the issues that were tackled within it from 400 years ago, like Hamlet, they're just as relatable as they are now in 2026. If you've not watched the movie, then this video would have definitely spoiled it for you, but please don't let that stop you from going to watch it. It's a heartbreaking, beautiful piece on life, the fragility of it, and how, even though we can suffer the most traumatic of times, whether it be alone or together, humans find a will and a way to get through it. So, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed this breakdown on Hamnet. It's a movie that I thoroughly enjoyed watching, and it provided a lot of food for thought when I was walking home after watching it, so I'm glad to have finally taken to the internet and been able to get all of this off my chest. If you enjoyed Hamnet, then please tell me what you liked about it in the comments, and if you didn't, then also share why too. The next movie that I'll be tackling like this will be Train Dreams, so be sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the video when I break it down. If you've made it this far, then thanks for watching until the end, and I'll see you in the next one.